The Duke of Wellington once said, "There was never a country in which poverty existed to the extent it exists in Ireland." In 1837, there was a survey of the miserable living conditions of the people of this area, Gertahurk in County Donegal. Of the 9,000 people living here at the time, there were only 10 beds and 93 chairs. Put that another way, for every 90 people there was only one chair to sit on, and for every 900, only one bed to sleep in. In the 100 or so years before the famine, the thing that struck most visitors to Ireland was the poverty of the people.
Irish misery forms a type by itself of which neither the model nor the imitation can be found anywhere else. In all countries, paupers may be discovered, but an entire nation of paupers is what never was seen until it was shown in Ireland. To explain the social condition of such a country, it would be only necessary to recount its miseries and its sufferings. The history of the poor is the history of Ireland.
I have visited the wasted remnants of the once noble red man on his reservation grounds in North America and explored the Negro quarters of the degraded and enslaved African. But never have I seen misery so intense or physical degradation so complete as among the dwellers in the bog holes of Ireland.
Imagine 4 walls of dry mud, which the rain as it falls easily restores to its primitive condition, having for its roof a little straw or some sods, for its chimney a hole cut in the roof, or very frequently the door, through which alone the smoke finds an issue. One single apartment contains father, mother, children, and sometimes a grandfather or a grandmother. There is no furniture in the wretched hovel. A single bed of straw serves the entire family. In the midst of all lives a dirty pig, the only thriving inhabitant of the place, for he lives in filth.
By 1845, Ireland was a source of grave anxiety to England. Ireland had first been invaded in 1169. The country had been conquered not once, but several times. The land had been seized and redistributed over and over again. The population had been brought to the verge of extinction by the curse of Cromwell. Yet an Irish nation survived, separate, hostile, and growing more numerous every day. Ireland's problems in the 19th century were largely the fruit of a consistent long-term British policy, which was to ensure that John Bull's other Ireland could never, ever threaten the political or economic interests of John Bull himself. (1691).
No Catholic may be a member of Parliament, or vote, or hold any office under the government.
1695.
No Catholic may be educated abroad, or maintain a school in Ireland. Penalty, expulsion to the West Indies. No Catholic may buy land, raise a mortgage, or lease land for more than 31 years. On the death of a Catholic landowner, the land must be divided among all his sons. A son who becomes a Protestant automatically inherits all his father's property. In 1600, Protestants owned 10% of the land of Ireland. By 1778, Protestants owned more than 95% of the land of Ireland.
The law is a machine as well fitted for the oppression, impoverishment, and degradation of a people, and the debasement in them of human nature itself, as ever proceeded from the perverted ingenuity of man.
Persecution of minorities on grounds of religion was commonplace in the 17th century. Ireland, however, was unique in 2 ways. In Ireland, a small minority persecuted the majority, and the persecution lasted for a century longer than elsewhere. Because there was no industrial employment, access to a piece of land to grow food was literally the difference between life and death. Even the smallest pieces of rocky ground were brought into intense cultivation. In 1759, restrictions imposed almost a century earlier on the importation of cattle to England were removed. Ranching became economic again. Eviction of tenants and destruction of their homes became the order of the day. Whole villages were swept away.
Undoubtedly, it was the landlord's right to do as he pleased, and if he abstained, he conferred a favour and was doing an act of kindness. If, on the other hand, he chose to stand on his right, the tenants must be taught by the strong arm of the law that they have no power to oppose or resist. Property would be valueless, and capital would no longer be invested in cultivation of land if it were not acknowledged that it was the landlord's undoubted, indefeasible and most sacred right to deal with his property as he chooses.
As a result of the desperate competition for land, rents rose sixfold in the 18th century.
In Ireland alone, the whole agricultural population can be evicted by the mere will of the landlord. In Ireland alone, the bulk of the population, wholly dependent on the land, cannot look forward to a single year's occupation of it.
After the revision of rental agreements in the 1820s, Irish land was rented at about £2.50 per acre, a figure slightly in excess of that currently pertaining in Britain at the time. But in Ireland, the situation was exacerbated even more so by the fact that between the landlord and many of the tenantry there existed a level of middlemen, or a layer of middlemen, who extracted their own profit margin. The result was that very often subtenants in Ireland paid rents exorbitantly high. In County Armagh, for instance, in 1840 on the Mandeville estate near Tandregee, subtenants were paying upwards of £10 per acre for manured conacre land. A figure which, to put it in perspective, was being paid by a tenantry earning upwards of 1 shilling per day for their labour. And as a matter of interest, when I was completing a PhD thesis in 1973, conacre in that same part of Armagh was even then only retailing at £10 per acre, despite 130 years of inflation.
If a tenant's profits exceeded 1/3 of his rent, any Protestant who could prove the fact might take possession of the farm. Any improvements made by the tenant became the property of the landlord without compensation. On many estates, it was the practice to put a farm up for auction on the expiry of a lease. Therefore, tenants had no motive to improve, because if their property became more valuable, they might not be able to afford to buy it back at the auction.
I have asked the immigrant Irish farmer in America why he does not toil at home from sunrise to sundown as he does there. And I have asked the emigrant, about to leave his native shore for the unknown West, why he did not employ his little capital and labour in improving the land of Ireland. The answer invariably has been that they would much prefer toiling and expending their little capital at home if they had land at a fair rent, and leases which would enable them to enjoy with certainty the fruits of their labour.
In England, the relationship between the landlord and his tenantry was bonded somewhat by a similarity of religious background and also a background of geographical closeness. In Scotland, that bonding was increased even further by the fact that many Scottish landlords were in fact clan leaders and had a blood relationship with their tenantry. But in Ireland, that bonding did not exist to the same extent. Apart from Ulster, where in particularly eastern Ulster, there was a community of Protestant tenantry and Protestant landlords. Elsewhere in the country, it was for the most part a Protestant landlord system with a majority of tenantry who were Catholic. And differences in outlook, religious, social, and very often linguistic, compounded the separation of the landlord class from their tenantry in the Irish estate system.
Confiscation is the Irish landlord's common title, and from the first settlement they have been hemmed in on every side by the original inhabitants of the island, brooding over their discontent in sullen indignation.
Outside Ireland, tenants didn't usually kneel before their landlords. But Irish tenants were tenants at will, the will or even the whim of their masters.
A landlord in Ireland can scarcely invent an order which a servant, labourer or cottier dares to refuse to execute. Disrespect, or anything tending towards sauciness, he may punish with the most perfect security. Landlords of consequence have assured me that many of their cottiers would think themselves honoured by having wives or daughters sent for to the bed of their masters, a mark of slavery that proves the oppression under which people live.
Historically, the landlord figure in Ireland has been regarded as somewhat of a bête noire. In recent years, however, he has undergone a revision of character and identity, and today perhaps he is looked upon a little bit more kindly. However, I think it is worth pointing out that much of the revisionist thinking is based upon the analysis of well-run landlord estates which had very good written records. Poorly managed estates, the worst examples of landlordism in Ireland, generated few good manuscript sources. Those estates have not been studied to any extent. And as a result, we underestimate the weaknesses and the bad side of landlordism in our revisionism.
Landlords in Ireland are lazy, trifling, inattentive, negligent, slobbering, profligate.
My strong advice to you is to forget for 5 years at least that you have such a thing as a property in Roscommon, to leave it totally in the hands of your agent. Amuse yourself and your dear wife as youth and circumstances will allow for the present, and trust to a gracious providence that at that time you will have a chance of returning to an altered country.
The aristocracy of Ireland is not bad because it is absentee. It is absentee because it is bad. Because nothing attaches it to the country. Because it is retained there by no sympathy. Loving neither the country nor the people, why should it remain in Ireland when it has England nearby, inviting it by the charms of more elegant and refined society?
The export of money from Ireland, or the export of wealth, took place really through the export of rental returns. The landlord system, through its organisation, was able to extract wealth from all parts of the country, the poor marginal lands of the west, as well as the rich agricultural lowlands of the east. That money was exported in rents, largely to Britain. The part of it retained in Ireland was very often expended in a form of what Galbraith would call conspicuous consumption, invested in the construction of 18th century Palladian houses, elaborate domain lands, and also in the later 18th century in the construction of landlord villages, such as, for example, the village of Maynooth. But all of these investments tended to be rather more conspicuous than investments in terms of productivity.
In 1779, the drain of rents to absentee landlords was £732,000, an enormous sum at a time when the total annual revenue of Ireland was little more than 1 million. Attempts to reduce this loss of capital by a tax on absentee landlords failed. In 1842, it's estimated that £6 million in rents were being remitted out of Ireland every year, helping to fuel the growth of British commerce and industry. Before disestablishment in 1870, the Church of Ireland also imposed a considerable burden on the Irish people. Catholics were obliged to pay a tithe, or 1/10 of their produce, to the Church of Ireland. Tithes provided a revenue of £600,000 a year. Even when there was no minister in 151 parishes in the south and west, the people still had to pay.
The Irish tithe system was indeed one of the most absurd that can be conceived. They were paid by an impoverished Catholic peasantry to a clergy who were opposed to their religion and usually not even resident among them.
In accordance with the vote of the House of Commons in 1735, the wide pasture lands of the wealthy planters were declared exempt, while the produce of the Catholics' miserable little patch was tithed. Archdeacon Ryder lived in this house in Cork at a time when the peasantry began to organise opposition to tithes. The Reverend Archdeacon, who was in this case also Justice of the Peace, set out with a force of horse, foot soldiers and police to enforce the payment of tithes.
This is the house of the widow Ryan, near Rathcormac, County Cork. It was here on the morning of the 18th of December 1834 that the famous Battle of Gurtroo took place. The widow Ryan refused to pay her tithe to her Archdeacon Ryder, and he subsequently came here on that morning distraining cattle and corn for tithe. He encountered fierce opposition here at the barricades and all around the Haggard and all around the house. The military read the Riot Act and then proceeded to fire on the assembly. In the subsequent battle, 9 local people were killed and 45 wounded, of which 3 later died of their wounds.
Among the dead, the widow's son, shot watching from this doorway. The tithe war led to a change in the law whereby the landlord collected the money on behalf of the church by adding it to the rent. The Church of Ireland also received rents from 5 million acres of land that it owned in Ireland. If this enormous revenue had been spent in Ireland giving employment, the story might be different. But the problem for the Church of Ireland at the time was that appointments to bishoprics were handed out as political favours by the British government, and mainly to Englishmen who were concerned to enrich themselves and bring their riches back to England. At one time, 19 out of 22 so-called Irish bishops were English. The Irish economy was constantly being manipulated in the interests of England.
1663. Amendment to Navigation Acts. All exports from Ireland to the British colonies are forbidden. All imports from the colonies must be shipped through British ports. 1665. An act to forbid importation of Irish cattle, live or dead, into England. The act covers beef, bacon, pork, mutton, butter and cheese.
William Petty was the architect of the land survey which preceded the Cromwellian plantations.
Why should they breed more cattle, since it is forbidden to import them into England? Why should they raise more commodities, since trade is prohibited and fettered by the statutes of England?
Irish farmers turned to sheep. The woolen industry grew and employed many people at home and in factories. But when it became a threat to British industry, it was quickly suppressed.
That wool and woolen manufacture are the greatest and most profitable commodities of the Kingdom of England, that the great quantities of the like manufactures are daily increasing in the Kingdom of Ireland, and are exported from thence to foreign markets in the Kingdom of Ireland, and are exported from thence to foreign markets heretofore supplied from England, and that for the prevention thereof the export of wool and of woolen manufacture from Ireland be prohibited under the forfeiture of goods and ship, and a penalty of £500 for every such offence.
Between 20 and 30,000 Irish workers in the wool trade lost their jobs.
1746. Ireland forbidden from exporting glass to any country, or as much as can be laden on any horse or carriage with intent to be exported.
The same act forbade importation of glass into Ireland except from England. Similar enactments repressed manufacturers in cotton, silk, iron, hats, gunpowder, accordingly as they arose, or even threatened to compete with the growth of any similar industries in England. By 1800, Britain could no longer produce enough cattle for its growing population.
It appears that cattle, above all things, seem to be the most appropriate stock for Ireland. Corn can be brought from one country to another, from a great distance at rather small freights. It is not so with cattle. Hence the great hives of industry in England and Scotland can draw their shiploads of corn from more southern climates. But they must have a constant dependence on Ireland for the abundant supply of meat.
Poor Law Inquiry of 1835 stated that 3/4 of the labourers in Ireland existed without employment of any kind.
The nature of the Irish economy in the 18th and 19th centuries was such as to be fulfilling a complementary rather than a competitive role with that of England. The Irish economy was used to generate supplies of grain during the Napoleonic Wars. After the wars, generate supplies of meat for the demands of the British urban economy. In encouraging that complementarity, there was at the same time a wish to discourage competition. And through parliamentary edict, but more so perhaps through investment behaviour and trading links and mercantile activity, the competitive ethos was dampened down and the complementary situation or the complementary needs of the British economy magnified in Ireland's case.
Westport at the end of the 18th century really was a very prosperous place and a very happy place in many ways, because a lot of industry had been built up here, and in fact our own family here had been very much involved in the building up of that industry. And then it started to decline in the early part of the 19th century, and then the Industrial Revolution came in England, and British laws were passed that were very anti-Irish production from the point of view of industry, and because of that the whole of Westport's industry was on the slippery slope, really, by the 1820s and 1830s, and eventually slid right into the famine, in fact, which made the famine even a greater disaster because of that.
Social life was all there was, there being no work. Abundance of turf, however, meant that they were warm, and while the potato flourished, well fed. The miserably low standard of living encouraged young couples to marry early. Asked why they married so young, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Raphoe said,
"They cannot be worse off than they are, and they may help each other."
A half-acre could feed a family for a year with potatoes. This was less than 1/4 of the land needed to grow the equivalent amount of grain. In 1841, Ireland's population was 8,175,124, and Disraeli declared that Ireland was the most densely populated country in Europe, on arable land denser than that of China.
From the mid-18th century, the Irish population grew rapidly. However, the rate of growth was quite similar to that which was operating in England at the same time. The difference, however, between Ireland and England was really related to the fact that in Ireland, 80% of the population as late as 1840 was still employed in agriculture. In contemporary England, the growing population was absorbed within urban industrial milieus, and it could therefore contain a much greater population than that of the Irish countryside.
The scenario was set for tragedy, nor were people unaware. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, lived as a boy in Emmet Street in Trim, County Meath, and at nearby Dangan Castle. He wrote about the country which gave him birth.
I confess that the annually recurring starvation in Ireland gives me more uneasiness than any other evil existing in the United Kingdom. It is starvation, because it is the fact that although there is an abundance of provisions in the country of a superior kind, and at a cheaper rate than the same can be bought in any other part of His Majesty's dominions, those who want in the midst of plenty cannot get, because they do not possess even the small sum of money necessary to buy a supply of food. It occurs every year, for that period of time that elapses between the final consumption of one year's crop of potatoes and the coming of the crop of the following year. And it is long or short, according as the previous season has been good or bad. Now, when this misfortune occurs, there is no relief or mitigation, excepting the recourse to public money. The proprietors of the country, those who ought to think for the people, to foresee this misfortune and to provide beforehand a remedy for it, are amusing themselves in the clubs of London, in Cheltenham or Bath or on the continent, and the government are made responsible for the evil. And they must find the remedy for it where they can, anywhere excepting the pockets of Irish gentlemen. Then, if they give public money to provide a remedy for this distress, it is applied for all purposes excepting the one for which it is given, and most particularly to the payment of arrears of exorbitant rent. However, we must expect that this evil will continue and will increase as the population will increase, and that the chances of a serious evil, such as the loss of a large number of persons by famine, will be the greater.
Wellington's words were indeed prophetic. On the 15th of August 1845, the Gardener's Chronicle reported a potato blight of unusual character on the Isle of Wight. The following week it spoke of a fearful malady having broken out among the potatoes, with reports of devastation from all sides. 2 weeks later again, the presses were stopped to announce that the potato blight had reached Ireland. The crops around Dublin are suddenly perishing, the report said. Where will Ireland be in the event of a universal potato rot? Where indeed?